When I got the call about my uncle landing in jail again, I can't say I was shocked. He'd always been a smooth-talking, unpredictable type, the sort who seemed to have a knack for finding trouble and didn't much care about steering clear of it. But this time, it felt heavier. It wasn't just a few months, he was looking at a full 10 years. 10 years in prison, for being caught with over a pound of cocaine. They said he had it stashed in his car trunk, tucked away like it was just another bag of groceries. It hit hard. He'd told us he'd cleaned up, that those wild days were behind him. Even at Thanksgiving, he'd go out of his way to remind us all that he was staying out of trouble, keeping things straight. Sure, we had our doubts, no one really changes overnight, right? But a whole pound? None of us had expected that. My uncle swore the drugs weren't his, said he'd been set up, that someone was out to make sure he was out of the picture for good. But when we pushed him for more, he'd go quiet, muttering that 10 years in prison was still better than what they would do if he stayed free. Once he was sentenced, my mom called me, her voice tense, asking if I'd be able to go by his place and clear out his stuff. It was just one of those family obligations, the kind you feel like you can't refuse, even if you're not exactly thrilled about it. I wasn't particularly close to him, but family has this way of making you feel responsible, even when you know you shouldn't be. So, with him set to spend the next decade behind bars, I offered to pack up his apartment and haul his things to storage. I wasn't really sure why I felt so ready to jump in, but maybe it just seemed like the least I could do. The place was a mess, just as I expected. The kitchen cabinets were filled with thrift shop pots and pans, each one more scratched up and mismatched than the last. I could picture him there, cigarette dangling from his mouth, stirring some random concoction in those worn-out pans. The living room was its own kind of wasteland. Every surface was dotted with ashtrays, each overflowing with weeks of cigarette butts, and the walls had turned a sickly yellow from years of non-stop smoking. Even the light switches were caked in that same grimy shade, crusted over from the habit that had stained every inch of the apartment. It was clear he hadn't cracked a window in years. I caught myself running a finger along the wall, half expecting that yellow grime to rub off. But it didn't budge. In one corner sat his pride and joy, a Star Trek collection, lined up on a crooked shelf he probably hammered up himself. He'd been a fan as long as I could remember, always talking about episodes I'd never watched and characters I didn't know. Dozens of plastic figures with blank, focused expressions watched as I packed them away, my uncle's little treasures getting boxed up and ready to sit in storage, forgotten. It took a few days, but eventually, I managed to get the place mostly packed up. 3 trips in my truck, lugging boxes and crates across town to a storage facility, until there wasn't much left. All that remained were the stained carpet, nicotine-soaked walls, and blinds barely hanging from the windows. There was no chance he'd ever see that security deposit again, the damage was ingrained in the place. But, at this point, that didn't matter much. As I sorted through the last of the kitchen cabinets, my hand brushed against something tucked back in the shadows. I pulled it out and realized I was holding a small, worn leather book. The cover was cracked, softened by age, with a faint trace of cigarette smoke still clinging to it. The pages inside were yellowed, fragile, and marked with years of kitchen chaos, smudges, stains, and messy notes all over. The entries were scattered across the pages, with recipes jotted down in no particular order, almost as if the person keeping this book had written them the moment inspiration struck, without any thought of organizing. As I skimmed through, a strange feeling crept over me, this book might have belonged to my grandfather. He'd been the one who brought our family together year after year with his cooking, especially over the holidays. Every big meal seemed to center around his dishes, recipes that no one else had ever managed to fully recreate. This book might actually contain the secrets to those meals, a piece of him that had somehow ended up with my uncle after Grandpa passed away. And yet, I couldn't shake an odd sense of dread as I held it. The leather felt cold in my hands, almost damp, and as I turned the pages, a chill ran through me. Something about the book felt off, like there was more to it than just family recipes. Curious, I brought it over to my mom. She glanced at the familiar handwriting looping across the yellowed pages, and her face softened with recognition. "This was your grandfather's," she said with a kind of quiet awe, tracing her fingers along the ink. She hadn't seen the book in years, and when I told her I'd found it at my uncle's, a flicker of surprise crossed her face. She'd been searching for it for ages but had never realized her brother had held on to it all this time. As she turned the pages, I could see nostalgia mixed with something else, a hint of sadness or maybe reverence. I could tell this book meant a lot to her, which only made me more determined to keep it safe. "Would you mind if I held on to it a bit longer?" I asked. "I'd like to make a digital copy, just to make sure we don't lose any of Grandpa's recipes." Mom agreed without a second thought, grateful that I was taking the time to preserve something she hadn't even known was still around. So, I got to work. Over the next few weeks, whenever I had a spare moment, I carefully scanned each page. I wasn't focusing much on the recipes themselves, just making sure each one came through clearly and legibly, not paying close attention to the odd ingredients or strange notes scattered here and there. My only goal was to make sure the book's contents were saved, bringing it to life in a digital form that would last. When I finished, I spent a few hours piecing the scans together, creating a complete digital version. Once it was ready, I handed the original book back to my mom, feeling a strange mix of relief and satisfaction. The family recipes were preserved, and I thought that was that. But that uneasy feeling I'd had while holding the old leather book stayed with me a little longer than I'd expected. In the months that followed, I didn't think much about the recipe book. Scanning it had been just a side project, something I'd intended to follow up on by trying to cook a few of Grandpa's classic dishes. But like so many little projects, life got in the way, and the book and its recipes slowly faded to the back of my mind, filed away and mostly forgotten. Thanksgiving came around, and I drove over to my parents' place, expecting the usual spread, turkey, stuffing, all the familiar dishes we'd had for years. But as soon as I walked in, I noticed something off. A large bird sat at the center of the table, perfectly roasted, but something about it didn't look right. It seemed smaller than a turkey, and its skin was darker, almost rough-looking, not the usual golden brown I expected. "Nice chicken," I joked, thinking they'd just switched things up this year. But my mom shook her head. "It's not a chicken," she said softly. "It's a hen." I raised an eyebrow. "What's the difference?" I asked, half laughing, expecting her to give me a quick answer. But she just looked at me with a distant expression, her eyes unfocused like she'd gotten lost in her own thoughts. For a second, it was like she didn't even hear me. Then, she blinked and looked at me again. "It's just what the recipe called for," she said, her voice carrying a strange tone I couldn't quite place. Her words made the hair on my arms stand up, but I shrugged it off, figuring she'd just been stressed from all the cooking. Still, as I glanced back at the bird, a small feeling of unease crept in, lingering in the back of my mind. Later, while my mom cleared the table, I pulled my dad aside in the kitchen and asked in a low voice, "What's up with Mom tonight?" He shrugged it off casually, chuckling a little. "You know how she gets," he said, smiling. "She's just excited." But I couldn't shake the oddness. The whole dinner had felt different. The hen, a first for us at Thanksgiving, was covered in a sweet-smelling sauce with a faint hint of walnut, almost masking a pale, ashen color underneath. The bird was surrounded by strange, decorative greens and perfectly sliced parsnips and radishes, arranged almost too neatly, like it was all meant to look a certain way. The setup was way more elaborate than Mom's usual style. When we finally sat down, she led us in grace, her voice soft and serious. As she carved the hen, a glimmer of excitement lit up her face, a look I wasn't used to seeing from her. She served each of us with such care, watching us intently as we took our first bites. Right away, I knew this wasn't the usual holiday meal. The meat was tough, almost stringy, and didn't tear easily, nothing like the tender turkey or chicken we usually had. Mom kept glancing at us, her eyes wide and eager, like she was waiting for us to react or notice something. It was unsettling, watching her, and I finally had to ask, "What's got you so excited, Mom?" She smiled, her face softening. "Oh, it's just, this cookbook you found from your grandfather's things. Cooking from it feels like having him here with us again." Her voice was filled with a reverence I hadn't heard in years, like she was talking about something more than just food. I nodded, trying to humor her. "Tastes good," I said, hoping to ease the tension a little. I liked it. But, honestly, I found myself wishing we'd stuck with the usual Thanksgiving dinner. The meal wasn't terrible, but something felt a little off. I couldn't quite place it, and part of me didn't want to. After dinner, I said my goodbyes and headed home, trying to shake the weird feeling that had settled over me. My mom's intense excitement, the strange way she prepared the meal, it all replayed in my mind. And then there was the hen itself. Why a hen? Why that pale, ashen sauce? There was an almost ritualistic quality to it, like she'd followed the recipe with a strange kind of precision I'd never seen from her before. The questions kept me up that night, tugging at the edges of my mind and refusing to let go. Back at home, still rattled, I sat down at my desk and pulled up the scanned file from the cookbook. It had been sitting on my desktop for months, untouched, but now I finally had the urge to open it. As I scrolled through the pages, I saw why I'd put it off. The handwriting was dense and elaborate, like old-fashioned calligraphy, each letter curling and twisting into the next. The words seemed to flow across the page in a strange, almost playful way. I leaned in closer, squinting to read each line. As I went through the recipes, a chill ran through me. They had odd, unsettling names, titles that sounded more like old spells than anything you'd cook. Things like Mother's Last Supper porridge, binding broth of bone and leaf, Elder's ember bread, and hollow heart soup with morning onion. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination, but a heavy feeling seemed to fill the room, as though the words themselves carried a strange, almost eerie energy. That's when I found it, the exact recipe my mom had made for Thanksgiving, Ancestors' Offering. The title was written in the same swirling, old-fashioned calligraphy, and a knot tightened in my stomach as I scanned the description. It called for a maple braised hen with black walnut and root puree, but the language made it sound ancient, like something straight out of a centuries-old ritual. Every ingredient was listed with meticulous detail, each one almost treated like it held some kind of hidden power. I skimmed down to the part about the meat. It specified a hen, specifically, the body of a mother. A shiver crawled up my spine, remembering how Mom had corrected me when I'd casually called it chicken. She'd been adamant it was a hen. The recipe continued, instructing that the hen be served on a bed of lamb's lettuce, which I quickly Googled to learn was actually a type of honeysuckle. But then, as I kept reading, an icy chill settled over me. The recipe advised that the dish should be served just before the end of twilight, as dusk surrenders to night. My mind flashed back to Thanksgiving, to the moment we'd sat down, right as the last sliver of sunlight dipped below the horizon. But the final instruction was the most disturbing, and it twisted my stomach into knots. The recipe called for something called Ancestors' Salt. A note at the bottom explained this salt was a sprinkle of ashes from those who have returned to the earth, warning that it should be used sparingly, as each grain remembers the one who offered it. I leaned back, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin as I remembered the pale, ashen sauce that had coated the hen, the faintly sweet smell it gave off. My mind spun as the horrifying implications sunk in. Could my mom have actually used ashes in the meal? Could it have been my grandfather's ashes? I tried to push the thought away, chalk it up to old folklore nonsense. But the image of my mom's pleased, almost reverent expression as she served the dish drifted back into my mind. I felt a wave of nausea rise up, the thought clawing deeper into my mind, refusing to let go. For the next few days, the unease gnawed at me, growing impossible to ignore. I told myself I was probably overthinking it, that it was just a strange family tradition I didn't fully understand. But I couldn't shake the creeping dread that came every time I replayed that night in my mind. Finally, I decided to call my mom. I figured I'd approach it carefully, keep it casual. No way did I want her to think I was accusing her of doing something as insane as using ashes in our food. I started with small talk, asking about my dad, her garden, just warming her up a bit. Then I thanked her for the Thanksgiving dinner, even saying it was the best one in years. When I brought up the recipe book, her voice instantly brightened. "Oh, thank you again for finding it," she said, her voice warm and genuine. "I had no idea your grandfather had saved so many wonderful recipes. I knew his cooking was special, but to have all these dishes written down, like his own little legacy, it's been such a gift." I forced a chuckle, keeping my tone light. "Actually, I looked up that dish you made us, the ancestors' offering. Thought I might give it a try myself someday." "Oh, really?" she replied, sounding intrigued. "Yeah, though I thought it was kind of odd that the recipe calls specifically for a hen and not just regular chicken. They're so much tougher. And the line that says it should be the body of a mother." I let my words trail off, waiting, hoping she'd offer some kind of explanation that would make everything seem less unsettling. For a moment, silence hung between us on the call. Then, finally, Mom replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Well, that's just how your grandfather wrote it, I suppose." There was something off in her tone, calm but hesitant, as if each word was carefully chosen. My pulse quickened, but I tried to sound casual. I also noticed it mentioned something called ancestors' salt. I paused, feigning confusion, pretending I hadn't read the ominous footnote. "Do you know what that's supposed to be?" This time, the silence stretched out even longer, filling my ears with a tense, humming quiet. When she finally spoke, her voice was faint, distant. I have to go," she murmured, sounding strangely dazed. Before I could respond, the line clicked dead. I called her back, but it went straight to voicemail. Her phone was off. I sat there staring at the screen, my stomach twisting. I wasn't sure what scared me more, what I might uncover, or what I might already know. Finally, I decided to call Dad, hoping he'd shed some light. When he answered, I told him about my conversation with Mom and how distant she'd been. "She went straight out to her garden after you called," he said, sounding completely unconcerned. "Started tending her plants. Hasn't said a word since." I nudged him, asking if he'd mind talking to her for me. But he just brushed it off. "You're reading too much into it. You know how your mother gets, she's sentimental about family stuff. Just let her be. It'll only upset her if you keep pushing." I nodded, forcing myself to accept his advice. "Yeah, you're probably right." After we hung up, I resolved to let it go, to chalk it all up to Mom's usual attachment to anything sentimental. She'd always treated family heirlooms with a reverence, almost as if they held some kind of magic. But this time, the unsettling feeling lingered, scratching at the edges of my mind. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. Sitting down at my computer, I reopened the digital copy of Grandpa's recipe book. I knew it was a bad idea, but I couldn't resist. I let the file scroll aimlessly until it landed on the very last page, where a recipe titled Elder's Emberbread appeared. The instructions were minimal, each word heavy with purpose. Beneath the title, a note read, "Best served in small portions on cold, dark nights. The taste is best enjoyed alone, lest the voices of the past linger too long." I laughed a little, half amused, half unnerved. Just old folklore, I told myself, though the words had my heart beating faster. Ignoring the creeping chill, I printed the recipe and took it to the kitchen. It's just bread, I thought. Nothing more. As I started, it felt like time slipped away, as though I was moving in a fog. My mind blurred, details fading as I gathered ingredients like I was in a trance, as if following an old, familiar rhythm. I remembered flashes, the sweet tang of elderberries and honey, the earthy weight of raw rye, and the dry, biting scent of wood burnt to charcoal. At some point, I even caught myself murmuring words of thanks to my ancestors without thinking, a ritual I hadn't planned. The smell of warmed goat's milk and darkened butter hung in the air, mixing with the faint, smoky trace of yew ash. By the time I snapped out of it, the kitchen was quiet, steeped in shadow. And on the counter sat the bread, a dark, dense loaf, blackened at the crust but gleaming with an odd, almost unnatural sheen. It looked rich, moist, and as I stared, a strange sense of pride swelled within me, something eerie whispering in the back of my mind that I'd done well. Without realizing it, I cut myself a slice and took it to the living room, compelled by a quiet urge to taste my creation. I took a bite, and my mouth filled with an earthy, bittersweet flavor, smoky with a subtle sweetness from the berries. It was unique, unlike anything I'd tasted before. Satisfying, almost. As I chewed, a warmth spread through my chest, radiating like the steady heat of a fire. It was comforting, almost intimate, as though the bread itself was wrapping me in warmth. And before I knew it, I'd finished the slice, not because I loved it, but because some quiet need compelled me to finish every bite. Setting the plate down, I felt the warmth settle deep within me, a steady pulse that felt alive. And in the silence, I could have sworn I felt a faint, rhythmic beat, an ancient heartbeat pulsing beneath my skin. Over the next few weeks, I found myself drifting back to the elders' ember bread more often than I meant to. Sometimes, I'd find myself in the kitchen, halfway through slicing a piece without realizing how I'd gotten there, guided by some quiet impulse on those late, quiet nights. Each time I bit into the ember bread, a deep warmth spread through me, radiating like embers from a smoldering fire. Unlike the strange, unsettling feeling the hen had left me with, the ember bread was different. Every bite seemed to hold a familiar, almost affectionate essence, as though some labor of love had been woven into each grain. The days blurred together, but my questions stayed sharp. I tried calling my mother, hoping she'd finally open up about the recipe book, explain why we both seemed drawn to these peculiar dishes. But every time I brought it up, she dodged the topic, changing the subject or brushing me off, claiming she was too busy to talk. We hadn't had dinner together since Thanksgiving, and a quiet distance grew between us. Even Dad, when I asked, just shrugged and chalked it up to her going through a phase. But her cold responses and her repeated evasion of the book only made me more certain she was hiding something. Still, the pull of the ember bread remained strong, especially as the sun dipped below the horizon, as though something unseen was guiding me back to it. Each bite felt less like a meal and more like a communion, a quiet connection that deepened with every slice I consumed. After weeks of silence and unanswered questions, I finally reached out to my uncle at the prison. I left a brief message, letting him know I'd put $100 in his commissary account. The next day, he called me back, his voice scratchy but appreciative. "Hey, thanks for that," he said with a short laugh. "Money makes things a little easier in here, you know." We caught up a bit. He'd been in and out of prison so many times, it felt like he'd accepted it as his way of life. Now in his 60s, he spoke about his years behind bars with a strange kind of calm, even relief. "By the time I get out again, I'll be an old man," he joked. Not the worst place to get old, I guess. I took a breath, steadying myself before mentioning the real reason I'd called. "When I was packing up your stuff, I found this old recipe book." I hesitated, then added quickly, I gave it to Mom. Thought she'd appreciate it." His response was instant. The warmth in his tone evaporated, replaced by something cold and urgent. "Listen to me," he said, his voice tight and deliberate. "If you have that book, throw it into a fire." "What?" I stammered, taken aback. "It's just a cookbook." "It's not just a cookbook," he replied, his voice low and shaking slightly. "That book, it brings out dark things in people." He paused, as if weighing how much to tell me. "Our father, your grandfather, he got into things he shouldn't have, things you don't just find in an old family recipe. And that book? He exhaled, his tone grim. It wasn't even his. It belonged to his mother, your great-grandmother. It was passed down to him before he even understood what it really was. My mother used to say those recipes were meant for desperate times, for people willing to risk more than they should. His words settled over me with a weight I hadn't anticipated, everything finally beginning to make a strange, eerie kind of sense. These recipes, they were used to survive when times were hard, he went on, voice quiet but steady. You know what people did during the Great Depression, how desperate folks were, but this. He drew a sharp breath. These recipes are old, passed down long before anyone thought to write them down. They're not meant for everyday meals. They're meant to draw things out, to awaken something. And once those things take hold, it's hard to shake them. A cold shiver ran down my spine as my grip tightened around the phone, memories of the ember bread flashing through my mind, the warmth that had spread through my chest, the satisfaction that had felt strangely outside myself. Promise me, he said, his voice nearly pleading. Don't let Mom or anyone else use that book like it's a regular cookbook. Sure, those recipes might keep someone alive through the worst of times, but they come with a price, and it's one you're not ready to pay. I felt an icy dread settle over me, the gravity of what he was saying weighing heavier than I could ignore. Swallowing, I admitted the truth, I'd already made something from the book. I described the elder's ember bread, its earthy sweetness, the comforting warmth it brought, though I left out the feeling of compulsion that had driven me to finish every bite. He let out a harsh sigh, his tone sharp and scolding. You never should have touched that bread. None of it. Do you understand? Regret flooded me, and I mumbled, I know. I'm sorry. I won't make anything else from it. I promise. Good, he replied, his tone softening a bit. But that's not enough. You have to get that book away from my sister, your mother, before she goes too far. I tried to assure him I'd do my best, but he cut me off, his voice deadly serious. No, you need to do this. You have to understand, something bad will happen if you don't. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, I stayed in touch with him, paying the fees for each call, every conversation circling back to that book. I'd tell him what little progress I'd made, how I'd tried visiting my mom, only for her to brush me off, saying she was too busy or it just wasn't a good time. And each time we spoke, she felt colder, more distant, as if that recipe book were casting its shadow over her. Eventually, I dropped by her place unannounced. She opened the door with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. You should have called first, she said, voice clipped. It's rude to just show up like this. Her tone stung, sharper than I expected. I shrugged it off, saying I'd missed her and thought I'd stop by to check in. But as I glanced around the house, a chill crept up my spine. I looked for any sign of the book, hoping to find it and somehow slip it out of the house, but there was no trace. And every time I left, I felt an unsettling sensation, like I was being watched as I walked out the door. My uncle's calls grew more desperate, his tone increasingly strained. You have to try harder, he'd say, voice low with urgency. If you don't get that book away from her, something's going to happen. You need to believe me. And I did. Deep down, I believed every word. The memory of the ember bread, the warmth, the strange pull of that recipe gnawed at me, as though warning me of something far worse lurking in that book. And it wasn't just that, there was something in my mother's voice, her distant gaze, her clipped words, that felt wrong. Each time I left her place, I felt a chill, as if I were inching closer to something I wasn't prepared to see. Christmas Day finally came, and despite her evasions, this time there was no avoiding me. I gathered the gifts I'd bought for my parents, packed them into my car, and drove to their house, hoping that somehow, amid the warmth of the holiday, the tension that had grown between us might finally ease. When I knocked, she opened the door and gave me a quick, hollow hug. The rich, familiar smell of baked ham and sweet glaze drifted out, thick and inviting. For a second, I thought maybe she'd finally set aside that strange recipe book and return to her usual cooking. I felt a flicker of relief, hoping the day might go smoother than I'd braced myself for. "Where's Dad?" I asked, glancing around, expecting to see him somewhere close. "Oh, he's in the garage," she said, waving it off casually. "Got himself a new gadget he's been fussing with, you know how he is." She gestured toward the dining room, where plates were set up with neat holiday decorations. "Why don't you go on and sit down? Lunch is almost ready." I shrugged off my coat, watching her as she moved about, adjusting things at the table. There was something different, something unsettling in her movements, stiff and almost robotic, as if she were there in body but not in spirit. The usual warmth in her seemed strangely absent, replaced with a detached focus that made me uneasy. Not wanting to upset her on Christmas, I placed my gifts beneath the tree and sat down at the table. The plate in front of me was pristine, silverware aligned with precise care on either side, but the emptiness of it left a hollow feeling in my stomach. "Should I go get Dad?" I called out, glancing toward the hallway that led to the garage. Normally, he'd be the first to greet me on a holiday, full of cheer. The silence on his end felt odd, unsettling. "He'll come when he's ready," she replied from the kitchen, her voice floating back. "He had a big breakfast, so he'll join us later. Let's go ahead and start." Something in her tone didn't sit right. My dad wouldn't miss a Christmas meal, not for anything. A quiet, insistent thought tugged at me, casting doubt. Maybe it was that recipe book again, creeping into every corner of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "I'll just go say hello to him," I said, rising from my seat. Before I could take a step, she entered the room, carrying a large ham on an ornate silver platter. The meat was darker than usual, almost blackened, and the thick glaze clung to each crisscross cut she'd made in the skin. The bone jutted from the center, pale and stark against the charred meat. "Sit down," she said sharply, her voice uncharacteristically firm, with an edge that cut through the room. "This is a special meal. Let's enjoy it together." I hesitated, glancing between her and the garage door, her words, "special meal," echoing in my head like a warning. But I stood my ground, an uneasiness churning in my stomach. "I just want to see Dad," I insisted. "I haven't even said hello yet." Her face tightened, her grip on the platter going white-knuckled as her voice rose. "Sit down and have lunch with me," she said, each word brittle, as if it were meant to be an unbreakable command. But something inside me pushed back. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. "No," I said firmly, my voice louder than I intended. "I've had enough, Mom. You've been obsessed with that damn recipe book, and I'm done with it." My heart pounded as I looked her straight in the eye, feeling my words settle heavy in the air. "I'm going to the garage to get Dad. This stops here." Her expression shifted, a look of desperation flashing across her face. "Please, just sit down," she pleaded, her voice cracking as her eyes dropped to the empty plate in front of me. "Let's share this meal. It's important." Ignoring the discomfort knotting in my chest, I took a step toward the garage, determined to bring my dad out and put a stop to whatever this was. Her eyes widened, and with a shriek, she threw herself in front of the door, her arms outstretched, blocking my path. Her face was flushed, her eyes wild, her voice rising in a panic. "Don't go in there. Please, just sit down. Enjoy the meal, savor it," she pleaded, her hands trembling as they reached out to me, almost as if trying to hold me back with sheer desperation. Her voice quivered, heavy with something that sounded too close to fear, not just of me, but of whatever lay on the other side of that door. "Mom, you're acting crazy. We need to talk, and I need to see Dad." I tried to push past her, but she held her ground, her frame thin and unsteady but somehow still blocking my way. "Please," she whispered, barely audible, her voice thin and raw. "You don't understand. Don't disturb him, Dad." I shouted, cutting through her frantic pleas. At first, only silence answered. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it, a muffled, unnatural sound, low and guttural, rising from behind the door. I froze, a cold wave of dread washing over me as the noise thickened into a horrible, wet gurgling. My mother's face went ashen, her eyes going wide with a terror that confirmed my worst fears. She knew what I'd heard. Adrenaline surged through me. I shoved her aside before she could react and yanked open the door. The sight that met me in the garage would haunt me for the rest of my life. I took one step inside and froze, a sickening jolt twisting my stomach as I took in the scene. My dad was sprawled across his workbench, his face drained of color, glistening with sweat. Just above his thigh, his right leg was bound tightly with a belt, a makeshift tourniquet doing a poor job of stopping the blood. A pillowcase was wrapped around the raw, exposed stump where his leg had been crudely severed, blood pooling on the cold concrete floor beneath him, dark and shimmering in the harsh fluorescent light. He lifted his head weakly, his eyes glassy, barely able to focus. His mouth opened and closed, fighting to form words, a raspy whisper slipping out as he tried to speak. "Help, me." Without a second thought, I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands, my fingers barely able to hit the right buttons. Behind me, my mother's shrill screams filled the air as she staggered into the garage, her arms outstretched, her voice rising in desperate pleas. "Stop. Please. Just sit down, just have lunch with me." She wailed, her voice frantic and high-pitched, teetering on the edge of sanity. Her face was twisted with desperation, tears streaming down as she clawed at the empty air. But I barely registered her. I was already relaying the scene to the dispatcher, my voice cracking. "It's my dad, he's lost his leg. He's barely conscious," I stammered, my words tumbling out in a rush. "Please, you need to hurry." The dispatcher assured me help was on the way, their calm voice steady, but my mother's frantic cries filled the space, creating a haunting, echoing refrain. She clutched her head, her fingers digging into her scalp, her voice a trembling chant. "Please, just come back to the table. Just eat. You have to eat." I backed away slowly, my heart hammering, keeping as much distance as I could between us. She circled back toward the dining room, her cries rising and falling, her wails and pleas filling the garage in a fevered pitch that made my blood run cold. The flashing lights appeared outside sooner than I expected, spilling into the garage and casting long shadows against the walls. Police officers rushed in, assessing the scene before springing into action. My mother shrieked and fought, flailing wildly as they restrained her, her sobs turning incoherent, guttural as they led her out of the garage. I watched, numb, unable to look away as they took her down the driveway. Her voice carried, a twisted, mournful cry, begging me to come back to the table, to sit with her, to eat. Paramedics came in next, moving quickly to stabilize my dad and lift him onto a stretcher. I followed them out, moving through the motions in a daze, barely feeling the icy December air against my skin as I tried to make sense of what had happened. Her words echoed in my mind, looping endlessly, weaving together with the blood-stained memory from the garage. That Christmas, the warmth of family and holiday traditions had been twisted into a dark and surreal nightmare, something beyond understanding. I knew I'd never be able to look back on it the same way again. It was a day that had burned itself into my memory, a horror I would carry with me always. I stayed by my father's side every day at the hospital, watching over him as he slowly regained strength. On good days, when the painkillers were working and his mind was clearer, he told me everything he could remember about the last month with my mother. She'd been making strange, elaborate meals every single night since Thanksgiving, insisting he try each one. At first, he thought it was just a new holiday tradition, a way to honor Grandpa's recipes, but as the dishes grew more unusual, more disturbing, he realized something was deeply wrong. She had started mumbling to herself while she cooked, almost like she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. Eventually, he'd stopped eating at the house altogether, sneaking out for meals at nearby diners, finding any excuse he could to avoid her food. He even admitted that on Christmas morning, when he tried to leave, she had drugged his coffee. Everything went hazy after that, and the next thing he remembered was waking up to pain and the horror of what she'd done to his leg. We discussed the recipe book in hushed tones, both coming to the same terrible conclusion: the book had changed her. My father was hesitant to believe anything so sinister at first, but the memories of her frantic insistence, the look in her eyes, made him certain. Somehow, in some dark, twisted way, the book had drawn her into its thrall. By New Year's Eve, he was discharged from the hospital. I promised him I'd stay with him as he recovered, my own guilt over the role I'd unwittingly played gnawing at me. He accepted, his eyes carrying the quiet pain of someone forever altered. My mother, meanwhile, was undergoing evaluation in a psychiatric hospital. Since that Christmas, I hadn't seen her. I'd gotten updates from the doctors. They said she was calm, coherent, but that her words remained disturbing. She admitted to doing what she did to my father, repeating over and over, "We need to do what we must to survive the darkest days of the year." Her voice would drop to a whisper, a distant look in her eyes, as though the phrase were a sacred mantra. On New Year's Eve, as the minutes ticked toward midnight, my father and I went out to his backyard fire pit. I carried the recipe book, feeling its familiar weight in my hands one last time. Without a word, I tossed it into the fire, watching as the flames curled around the old leather, devouring the yellowed pages. It crackled and twisted in the heat, the recipes that had plagued us dissolving into ash. My father's hand on my shoulder was the only anchor I had as the smoke rose, dissipating into the cold night air. But as the last ember faded, I felt a pang of something like regret. Later, as I sat alone, staring at my computer, I hovered over the file on my desktop. The digital copy, each recipe scanned and preserved in perfect, chilling detail. I knew I should delete it, erase any trace of the book that had shattered my family. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to do it. I fear that it may have a hold on me,